This is not the first time we talk about the war in Ukraine, and this won't be the last time we address this political ambition behind Vladimir Putin. But meanwhile, when we talk about Putin, we talk about Ukraine, we have to bring US into our conversation. Everyone knows that today, this political intersection is getting more complicated. And on one hand, we've seen that former US President Donald Trump is eyeing for this 2024 presidential election and gearing up for more effort to the voters. But meanwhile, Kamala Harris, hopefully she's going to become the new nominee for the Democratic Party, that she has not come out saying anything about the war yet. But right now within the international community, everyone is very concerned about this, what we call the Trump doctrine under Donald Trump, especially regarding the war in Ukraine. How should we understand that? And does that mean that Donald Trump is able to solve the issue or solve the war, like he said, within the 24 hours? Is this just political or campaign soundbite, or is something that we should look into? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Dr. Alexander Motyl. Dr. Motyl is an American historian and also a political scientist. And he's a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. Well, Dr. Motyl, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me, Will, and it's a pleasure to be able to address your audience.
Well, Dr. Motyl, I want to get started. Recently, former U.S. Secretary of the State Mike Pompeo wrote an opinion piece on Wall Street Journal, which is entitled "A Trump Peace Plan for Ukraine." Now, within this article, he wrote something quite interesting, but meanwhile, it's still quite ambiguous. I want to read it to you and want to get your explanation or hopefully get your interpretation on this. This is what he wrote, and I quote, "While Mr. Biden stumbled into war through weakness, Mr. Trump could re-establish peace through strength and unleash Americans' energy potential. This will fire up the U.S. economy, drive down prices, and shrink Mr. Putin's war crimes budget." Dr. Motyl, you know we had multiple discussions regarding the war in Ukraine. But right now, let's talk about this, what Mike Pompeo called, and of course within the international community, everyone is also very concerned about this phrase called peace through strength. How should we understand that at this moment? And why do you think that by, let's say, acknowledging the strategy under Trump, or perhaps to understanding his strategy, how does that even peace through strength gonna work with Putin? Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, we don't know whether Mike Pompeo's article reflects Trump's thinking. It's conceivable, it's possible. More likely than not, he's trying to affect Trump's thinking on these issues, but we just don't know. So the article is encouraging, at least to my mind, because it mentions precisely what you just said, Will, namely that the way to proceed toward peace is by means of strength. And I'm glad that the article appeared, because finally it's not just Trump's opponents who are making this claim, but Trump's supporters. So there's a possibility that something is taking place within Trump's own thinking, possibly within the thinking of his supporters as well. We don't know, but possibly. What the phrase means is relatively straightforward. It rests on the assumption that Vladimir Putin will not make any kinds of concessions, unless he is forced to do so. In other words, his goal, and he's said this quite openly, and his supporters have said this quite openly, and I believe we've already talked about this in previous conversations. His goal is essentially the complete subjugation of all of Ukraine. That may entail the annihilation of Ukraine. That may mean its transformation into a colony. At that point, it's probably a combination of the two. But he hasn't expressed or shown any willingness or interest in any kind of concessions, in any kind of serious negotiations. Until now, again, he's said this quite openly. Ukraine has to recognize the current boundaries. It has to withdraw its troops from the 4 provinces that Russia claims as its own. It has to demilitarize. It has to abandon all hopes of joining the European Union and NATO. In other words, he will agree to Ukraine's capitulation and transformation into a colony. This is obviously a non-starter for all sorts of reasons. Now, if this is true, and that's the working assumption made by many East Europeans, certainly made by Ukrainians, and by many people throughout the world, frankly, then the only way that he might be persuaded to make concessions of any kind, and we don't even know whether we're talking about big concessions or little concessions, but any kinds of concessions, the only way he would make any kinds of concessions is if he had to. If he were forced to do so. And he could only be forced to do so either by means of some kind of internal insurrection in Russia, possibly an attempted coup, possibly an assassination by Russians, not Ukrainians, by Russians. That would possibly put the fear of God into him and lead him to some kind of changes. More realistically, if Russia were to start losing on the battlefield, and if Russian forces start losing and the Ukrainians start moving them back, and perhaps if the Ukrainians even score a major victory, this could, and I emphasize could, there is no guarantee with a person like Putin, but this could persuade him to make concessions and to go to the bargaining table. So, for instance, one of the goals Ukraine has is to destroy the military and economic infrastructure of the Crimea, isolate the Crimea, destroy the bridge, and essentially make it untenable for Russian forces. They would have to either be surrounded and agree to be surrounded, which would not work for the Russians, or they would have to withdraw. If Ukraine could pull something like that off, again, at this point in time, this is realistic, but semi-realistic. But if Ukraine could capture Crimea, this would be an enormous slap in Putin's face. He would lose face with his internal populations, his internal publics and elites, because, of course, he's played up the Crimea as being essential to Russia's continued existence. So if Crimea is lost, for example, again, I'm only saying this as an example, this could mobilize the opposition in Russia, and this could force Putin, both because of the losses on the battlefield and because of the pressure from his internal opposition, this could force Putin to make concessions and bargain in good faith. Until then, right, until something happens to Putin and he sees the light, he will not make any concessions, and he will not agree to any kind of fair negotiations.
Dr. Motyl, let's talk about this possibility that Ukraine joins NATO. I mean, again, this is something that you and we previously discussed. Not much, but again, as we're seeing this intensity of this political complication in the U.S., and also we believe that today some of the European countries, previously that some of them that they held strong belief that it's critical for Ukraine to become a NATO member. But right now, again, we're seeing the shift of the attitudes back and forth like a ping pong game. So some argue that today, for Ukraine to join NATO, it's a bit, quote, immature. But meanwhile, some argue that for Ukraine to join NATO, NATO should establish a $100 billion fund for arming Ukraine, and also while the U.S. share capped at 20%. 100%. So in other words, the European Union should swiftly admit Ukraine and help it to modernize and develop its economy. I mean, there's a lot more to unwrap, but Dr. Motyl, from your perspective, what kind of maturity are we talking about today by inviting or admitting Ukraine to NATO? And also the second thing is, why do you think it's crucial today? Some of the nations, especially from the European side, they are still holding this doubtful attitude about supporting Ukraine to be admitted into NATO. What is the complication behind this today as we continue to see the intensity of the war? Your thoughts?
Well, it's important to appreciate that joining NATO is not some kind of magic potion. In effect, Ukraine effectively already is enjoying the equivalent of NATO membership. Because, of course, the key thing to keep in mind, and I believe we've talked about this as well, is that according to Article 5 of the NATO Charter, countries will regard an attack on a member state as an attack on themselves. But then the article continues to say that they are not under any obligation to respond militarily. In other words, they are under obligation to respond, but how they choose to respond is completely up to them. And this is one of these false assumptions that people still make. They think that NATO membership will obligate the Europeans and the Americans to join the fight against Russia. Well, no. There is no statement in the Charter that says that the United States or the Europeans will have to send Marines or soldiers of any kind to support anybody, including Ukraine. And in fact, if you look at what the Europeans are doing, and you've already mentioned the billions of dollars that they'd like to raise, effectively the sanctions, the provision of military equipment, the provision of ammunition, this all fits within the framework of Article 5 of the NATO Charter. So in effect, the NATO members are responding to Ukraine as if it were already a member. So if Ukraine were to become a member tomorrow, which it won't, but assuming that it did, effectively nothing would change in terms of how the Europeans and other NATO members would have to respond. They could continue to provide weapons, they could continue to provide diplomatic support, financial assistance, and the like. So nothing technically would change. What the members of NATO fear, again, correctly or incorrectly, I'll discuss in a second, is that if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, let's say tomorrow or the day after, this will provoke Russia to take part, to escalate, and then thereby implicate the NATO countries in the war with Russia, which of course nobody wants to do. So the question is, what would Russia's response be if Ukraine becomes a member of NATO? Now, since Ukraine isn't going to become a member of NATO tomorrow or the day after, or even in a few months, its only chances of joining NATO are after the war ends, either presumably with the Ukrainian victory or something along those lines. But only then is a membership even remotely realistic, and even then it's unlikely to take place immediately. So to suggest that Russia will respond with an escalation misses the context of a potential membership. Yes, it's true, if Ukraine joins tomorrow, Russia might consider an escalation. Although, again, we don't know for sure. But if the war ends, and part of the deal is that Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, then Russia would be in no position to escalate. You see, so the context here is extremely important. Now, would Russia escalate? So let's assume even tomorrow or the day after, if Ukraine were to become a member. Again, the debate on that is split. Some people say yes, some people say no. My own personal view is that Russia has already escalated. I'm not exactly sure what people mean by escalation, since Russia is already destroying Ukrainian hospitals, cities, infrastructure, and the like. And ultimately, the question then comes down to, would Russia use nuclear weapons? And at that point, the question becomes, it essentially begins to concern the rationality of the Russian leadership. The United States has made it very clear that were nuclear weapons ever to be employed, the response, the conventional weapons response by America would be extremely severe and immediate. In all likelihood, a significant portion of Russia's armed forces would be destroyed by American missiles. So the question is, does Russia want to risk that kind of outcome? And here again, the voices are split. I'm personally inclined to think that Russia would have to be completely crazy to do that. And although I don't have much confidence in Putin's rationality, I do take some, I am relieved to some degree by the fact that using the nuclear weapons is not simply a matter of Putin going into a room and pressing a button. He would have to give the green light, and then something like 5 to 6 generals on the general staff would have to sequentially approve the use. So there are safeguards built into this, and one has to assume, or perhaps hope, that Russia's generals, who have already been deeply humiliated by the war, who've seen their armed forces be decimated and destroyed. Russia had the second most powerful army in the world a few years ago. Now it's become a shell of what it used to be. And this is all thanks to Putin. So do these generals want to destroy their army even more? And then eventually become without any army at all? And my personal assumption, my bet is that they would be very, very reluctant to do so. Because generals without an army are simply fools. But as you can see, there are all sorts of complicated and convoluted issues at work here. The bottom line is that Ukraine will not become a member of NATO tomorrow. There is simply no chance of that. And that it may become a member after the war ends. And it would only become a member if the war ends with a victory for Ukraine. So when one considers those as the realistic conditions, namely a victory for Ukraine, something like a defeat for Russia, subsequent Ukrainian membership, would Russia, under those circumstances, be inclined to escalate? I think the answer to that is that under those circumstances, no. It would definitely not escalate. You would be in no position to do so, having just lost the war thanks to peace through strength.
Dr. Motyl, I got 2 more questions before letting you go. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin. I mean, again, the report came out, of course, the news media came out one after another, that Vladimir Putin paid a short visit to one of the crucial members in Southeast Asia, which is Vietnam. I mean, when we think about the countries in Southeast Asia, number one, countries like Vietnam, it's not interested in involve itself in any international conflict, and let alone to taking sides. But according to the official state media come from Vietnam, that Vietnam for so long has been holding this what they called a bamboo diplomacy. So in other words, that the deeper roots in this Vietnamese political or communist party is deep rooted, is unshakable. But meanwhile, Vietnam, it's very flexible when it comes to friends, when it comes to building friendships and offering help. So the next question, Dr. Motyl, I want to ask you is, how should we interpret and understand Vladimir Putin's strategy by involving a country such as Vietnam into, again, not directly into the war, but indirectly involve itself into the conversation? I mean, we talk about the relationship between China and Russia. We had discussion about North Korea and Russia. But for so long that we barely, or even the whole world barely talk about Vietnam and Russia until Vladimir Putin paid a visit. So how do you think that we should understand this relationship between Vietnam and Russia? Is it just diplomatic, or is it personal, or Vladimir Putin as something bigger than what we are seeing today? Your thoughts?
Well, the important thing to remember is that Vietnam has very good relations with the United States, both economic as well as political and diplomatic. I mean, amazingly enough, considering the horrors of the war and the enormous losses suffered by the Vietnamese and to some degree by the Americans. But the relationship is essentially solid. And in contrast, if you look at Russia's economic relations with Vietnam, they're minimal. It's always been, before the war, Russia focused its economic relations on Europe. After the war, it's now been China and India. There's always a hope that some kind of activization of economic relations could take place with Vietnam. I do think there's just an essential barrier here, and that is that Vietnam enjoys good relations with America. And the question is, will it want to jeopardize those relations, which are mutually beneficial, for the possibility of having somewhat closer economic ties with Russia? I think ultimately that's not going to work. That's point one. As to why Putin did this, I think he's simply looking for, there are two things. He's looking for allies in the global south, especially. He doesn't, obviously he has none or very few within the OECD countries, but he claims to have the support of the global south, and any kind of overtures to the global south, especially if they're met with some degree of enthusiasm on the part of the other country, are welcome. But at the same time, it's a typical Putin strategy. He's causing trouble. He knows that Vietnam and the United States have good relations. And if there's anything he can do to undermine those relations, however minimally, why not? I don't think it'll work. The Vietnamese as you said, the Vietnamese have no interest whatsoever of being involved in some kind of war or to get involved in a major conflict between Russia, China, and the United States. It just doesn't make any sense from Vietnam's point of view. So I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it's terribly important. But nevertheless reflective of Putin's desires to cause trouble. It may also be reflective of Putin's desperation. He's looking for allies. He's looking for help everywhere, even amongst small countries. When you consider, we talked about North Korea before, when you consider that Russia claims to be a superpower, and instead the superpower is going begging for ammunition from North Korea, which is anything but a superpower. That's reflective, I think, of the position into which Putin has maneuvered Russia. It's a desperate position in many respects.
Dr. Motyl, I want to end our conversation by asking you the last question. Let's talk about what's happening in America today. I mean, again, we're seeing this complication, we're seeing this uncertainty of the political structure. Again, on one hand, we have the former US President Donald Trump, and again, during the convention, he announced that he picked J.D. Vance to be his running mate. But meanwhile, on the other hand, we are waiting to see what the Democrats are going to play out. I mean, clearly, the sitting U.S. President Joe Biden decided to pull out, and he endorsed Kamala Harris. And right now, we still don't know who the VP will be for Harris. But let's go back to the topic on the war in Ukraine. If I'm wrong, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that based on the rhetoric from Trump and Vance, that it's crucial for U.S. to take care of the domestic concerns rather than spending money overseas or helping other countries. You know, even I called it, I mean, again, even Donald Trump called it during one debate or during one interview that he believed that Vladimir Zelensky, it's one of the greatest salesmen, because every time that he comes to Washington, D.C., he walks away with billions of dollars. But if you look at the other side, and supporting Ukraine is crucial. I mean, again, this is not the war for Ukraine, but also the war for the whole humanity. So the last question, Dr. Motyl, I want to ask is, how much do you think such political complication will have effect upon the war in Ukraine today? So in other words, Zelensky or even the Ukrainians are very anxious at this moment because we don't know what's going to happen. But to what extent, or how much do you think that such uncertainty, such complication could have impact on the war and even possibly to the result of the war? Your final thoughts.
Well, you're absolutely right to focus on this question of uncertainty because that is the key issue at the moment. Putin is fully aware of this, Putin and his elites, and they are hopeful. I mean, on the one hand, they're pressing as much as they can at present because they're on the verge of a major deficit of armaments. But at the same time, they are hopeful that after the November elections in the United States, Vance and Trump will become vice president and president, and that will then open up possibilities of various kinds for Russia. That's clearly the way the Russians perceive this. Are they correct in thinking that Trump and Vance will be pro-Russian? That's really the open question. And frankly, no one knows. Unfortunately, for better or for worse, for every statement by Trump or Vance suggesting that he or they will stop supporting Ukraine, you can easily find another statement, sometimes made on the same day, suggesting they will support Ukraine. So I don't think they themselves know what their policy is going to be. And when Trump says, and when Vance supports him, and when Trump says he will end the war in 24 hours, that's obviously just exaggeration. That's just political talk. Just as when he says he's the most intelligent president in all of American history. One doesn't have to be a critic of Trump to suggest that perhaps that's an overstatement of sorts. So he has a tendency to make these very radical, sweeping statements. So whether he means 24 hours or not, I suspect the real issue is, does he think he has a strategy for dealing with both sides? And there is something to what he's been suggesting, namely, he'll tell the Ukrainians if they don't go to the table, he'll stop providing them with assistance. And at the same time, if the Russians don't go to the table, he'll provide the Ukrainians with a lot of assistance. The problem with that view is that I don't think neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians would believe that that's more than just a bluff. That's really the problem. So, will they go to the table? Sure. Putin will talk about anything as long as he gets what he wants, which is Ukraine's destruction. And Ukraine will talk about anything as long as it gets what it wants, which is its own continued survival. So you're talking about a zero-sum game. How does Trump expect to reconcile these positions is, of course, the question. And it's a question that no one really can answer, other than to suggest that peace through strength is the only way you can approach this. Because if you don't, you're simply relying on the goodwill of Trump and Putin, but especially of Putin. And the one thing we know from Putin's record is that we can't rely on his goodwill. So that would suggest that, one needs to look at the statements made by Trump and the statements made by Vance, but one also needs to look at the statements made by people like Boris Johnson, who claims that Trump will end the war. There's Mike Pompeo, whom you mentioned earlier, who says that Trump has the following plan. We simply don't know. What we do know, right? So in other words, it's a guessing game. We can more or less assume, we can probably assume that Kamala Harris will be at least as supportive as Biden. My guess is she'll be more supportive of Ukraine than Biden, but at least as supportive. So there is a constancy there. With regard to Trump, who knows? He changes his positions on an hourly basis, sometimes in the same speech. Vance, as you know, accused Trump of being Hitler 5 years ago. Now he's running as his running mate. So we can't be sure that Vance means what he says either. The one thing we can be sure of is that Trump is an egotist who truly believes that he is a genius. We also know that Putin is an egotist who truly believes that he is a genius. And then the question is, how will this possible conflict between two self-styled geniuses work out? And my guess, and I emphasize this is a guess, my guess is that Trump will do everything not to be humiliated and beaten by the Russian genius. I think he'll do that not because he cares about Ukraine. I don't think he cares about Russia, but he cares about himself. And if he gives in to Putin, it's not so much, I don't think he'll be concerned with what that means for Europe, America, and the world, and Ukraine. But that essentially will mean that he will have conceded that he's a lesser genius. And I don't think Trump, and I don't think Putin, but certainly Trump is capable of that kind of concession. So at the end of the day, I have a kind of moderate hopefulness. I'm not thrilled by Trump. I'm certainly not thrilled by Vance, but I suspect that he may wind up being less harmful to Ukraine than we fear. But as I said, this is only a suspicion. It's only a guess. I don't have the hard facts. I'm simply I'm projecting from what I think I know about Trump's personality.
Well, again, Dr. Motyl, at this moment, as we mentioned before, it's rather difficult to predict what will happen to this presidential election in America. And also, right now, the whole world continues to follow and pay attention to the war in Ukraine. Regardless what the results could be, and regardless who will be the next president, I think the fundamental element is we need to stand united and again stop the abuser from abusing the victims and from, again, ruthless behaviors to take over those innocent lives. I mean, again, this is crucial. It's not just for the international peace, It's really for the advancement of the human civilization. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to have Dr. Alexander Motyl back on the show. Again, he's an American historian and a political scientist, and he's a specialist on Ukraine, Russia, and the Soviet Union. Well, Dr. Motyl, again, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure, and we'd love to have you back on the show for our future episodes. Really appreciate your comments and your feedback and your insights every time. So thank you so much for doing this.